Picture, if you will, a hill that bleeds, not metaphorically, not poetically. After the spring thaw of 1943, survivors reported that the snow on Mamayev Kurgan melted black and red, the runoff staining the Volga River for weeks. The soil itself wept iron and blood, as if the earth had become a living wound that refused to heal. But here is where history crosses into something that defies natural law after the winter of 1942. Geologists documented something impossible. Mamayev Kurgan, Hill 102 on Soviet military maps, had grown taller, not by centimeters, but by meters, not from tectonic activity or sediment deposit, but from the sheer compression of human remains, shattered equipment, and unexploded ordnance pressed into the frozen ground by the weight of continuous bombardment. Welcome back to Ghost Stories of the Battles, where we unearth the dark remnants of history's most brutal conflicts. If you are fascinated by the paranormal scars left by war, if you believe that violence on a massive enough scale can wound reality itself, you are in the right place. Let me take you to Stalingrad, to a hill that became the focal point of perhaps the most savage battle in human history. Mamayev Kurgan was the strategic high ground overlooking the city and the life-giving Volga River beyond. Control the hill, control the city, control the city, control the war. Between September 1942 and January 1943, this single piece of elevated earth became an absolute hellscape that consumed human life at a rate that beggars comprehension. The hill changed hands between German and Soviet forces 14 times, 14 separate assaults and counter. Assaults, each one fought with a desperation born from the knowledge that defeat meant annihilation. The combat was medieval in its intimacy, despite the modern weaponry. Men stabbed each other with sharpened shovels in frozen trenches. They strangled enemies with their bare hands in shell craters, filling with freezing water. Artillery bombardments were so intense that the hill's winter snow never had a chance to settle. It was instantly vaporized or blackened by explosive residue. Soldiers fought in temperatures that dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, so cold that weapons froze. Blood crystallized before it hit the ground, and the dead remained perfectly preserved until spring. The official Soviet casualty estimates for just this one hill are staggering, approximately 35,000 dead. The Germans lost a comparable number, but historians believe the true figure is much higher, perhaps double. Because so many bodies were never recovered, never counted, simply absorbed into the earth itself. For months after the battle ended, the density of metal fragments in the soil was so high that compasses were useless within a kilometer radius. Even today, after decades of clearing operations, workers still unearth human remains with disturbing regularity. Today, a colossus stands guard over this mass grave. The Motherland Calls, an 85-meter statue of a woman with a raised sword, dominates the memorial complex, visible for kilometers in every direction. Officially, it honors the sacrifice of those who died defending their homeland. Millions visit each year, walking the same slopes where men died by the thousands, pausing for solemn photographs at monuments erected over bones. But beneath her watchful gaze, something continues. Night security guards request transfers. Maintenance workers refuse certain assignments. Locals avoid the hill after dark. And when pressed, they'll tell you the war never really ended up there. The violence was so concentrated, so absolute, that it burned itself into the fabric of the place like a brand on flesh. Today, I am going to share 4 terrifying true encounters from the bloodiest hill on earth. These aren't legends passed down through generations or folklore embellished over time. These are recent experiences, documented and corroborated, that suggest Mamayev Kurgan remains a battlefield where the fighting continues in shadows and silence. Our first story proves that some treasures should remain buried, and that greed can lead you into battles that ended decades before you were born. Story 1. The Magnetic Dead. In the years since the fall of the Soviet Union, a dark subculture has emerged across the former Eastern Front battlefields. They call themselves Black Diggers, illegal artifact hunters who prowl historic combat zones under cover of darkness, equipped with sophisticated metal detectors, GPS mapping devices, and an encyclopedic knowledge of military history. What they seek are relics, medals, weapons, personal effects, helmets bearing unit insignia. The black market for World War II memorabilia is vast and lucrative, with collectors in Western Europe and America willing to pay thousands for an authenticated piece of the Eastern Front. The Russian government officially prohibits this activity. The diggers are, technically, grave robbers, disturbing war dead and removing items that should be cataloged by official recovery teams. But enforcement is lax, penalties are light, and the potential profits are enormous. Most black diggers operate with an unspoken code: take the metal, leave the bones, and never ever speak about what you see. Alexei Volkov had been digging battlefields for 7 years by the time he decided to tackle Mamayev Kurgan. He was 34, a former metallurgist from Nizhny Novgorod who'd lost his job during economic restructuring and discovered he could make better money selling history than living in the present. He wasn't sentimental about it. Bones were bones. Metal was money. The dead didn't need metals anymore, and he had a daughter who needed dental work that insurance wouldn't cover. He'd done his research thoroughly, studying topographical maps from 1942 overlaid with modern satellite imagery, identifying a ravine on the northwestern slope that had been a German defensive position before being overrun in a Soviet night assault. Historical records indicated the position had been taken quickly. The survivors retreating under cover of an artillery barrage. That meant bodies left behind, weapons abandoned in panic, and potentially several hundred meters of trench line that had never been officially excavated. His metal detector was top of the line, Swedish manufacture, sensitive enough to distinguish ferrous from non-ferrous metals at depth. His GPS would mark every significant find. He chose a moonless night in late October when thick clouds rolled in from the Volga, turning the memorial complex into a landscape of absolute shadow. He bypassed the main gates easily. The hill was enormous, and despite security patrols, there were dozens of ways onto the grounds. He wore dark clothing, rubber, sold boots for silence, and carried everything in a mat. Black tactical backpack. The weight of his equipment was substantial, but Alexei was fit and motivated. At current black market prices, a single night could net him 3-month salary. The ravine was exactly where his research predicted, a depression in the landscape that modern memorial construction had left untouched, probably deemed too unstable for pathways. Trees grew at odd angles here, their roots disturbed by something beneath the surface. The ground was covered in dead leaves and patches of frost, burned grass. Alexei pulled out his detector, attached the headphones, and switched it on. The scream that erupted in his ears was so loud he nearly dropped the device. It wasn't the normal ping or beep of a metal detector finding a target. This was a continuous, deafening wail, as if the machine itself was in pain. Alexei tore the headphones off, his ears ringing. He checked the device. All the indicator lights were maxed out, the needles pinned to their limits. He'd never seen a reading like this, not even in artillery impact sites known to contain unexploded ordnance. He pulled his backup tool from his pack, an old military compass in a brass case, the kind that was reliable precisely because it was simple. He flipped it open to check his bearings before beginning to dig. The needle spun in wild, chaotic circles, never settling, as if north itself had ceased to exist. Alexei stared at the spinning needle, a cold understanding creeping into his gut. The entire area was a magnetic anomaly. The concentration of metal beneath him wasn't just significant, It was saturated. Thousands upon thousands of tons of steel, iron, and brass, all compressed together, all rusting into the earth, creating a magnetic field strong enough to overwhelm his instruments. He should have left. His instincts screamed at him to pack up and choose another location. But Alexei had not survived 7 years of illegal digging by listening to superstitious feelings. If there was this much metal here, there were artifacts worth serious money. He set the detector aside, useless in this concentration, and assembled his folding shovel. The first layer was topsoil and roots, normal enough, but as he dug deeper, the earth changed. It became denser, darker, mixed with fragments of rust and what looked like shredded cloth. At 30 centimeters down, his shovel struck something hard. He dropped to his knees, using his hands and a brush to clear the dirt. A helmet emerged, German, the distinctive coal, scuttle shape of a Stahlhelm. The paint was gone. The surface pitted with corrosion, but intact. Alexei's pulse quickened. Even in this condition, it might fetch 200 euros. He set it aside and kept digging. The helmet had been resting on something larger, more metal, curved and perforated, a rib cage. Alexei barely paused. He'd seen hundreds of skeletons. He worked around the bones, looking for what the soldier might have been carrying. His fingers found the outline of a weapon, but when he tried to pull it free, it wouldn't budge. He dug wider, exposing more of the item. It was a submachine gun, an MP-40, German issue. Except it wasn't lying beside the soldier. It was fused into the ribs, the rusted metal of the weapon seemingly melted together with the calcified bone. Alexei frowned and expanded the excavation further. That is when he understood what he'd found. This wasn't one body. It was multiple bodies, German and Soviet, compressed together in a flesh knot, a term black diggers used for the horrific tangles they sometimes discovered in places where close combat had been particularly savage. The German soldier had been killed with his weapon, and had fallen or been blown into a crater where Soviet bodies already lay. Then more bodies had fallen on top, and artillery had continued to pound the position, compressing them all together like some nightmarish sedimentary layer. As decades passed and decay did its work, the metal and bone had oxidized together into a single corroded mass. Twisted through the entire thing, still taut and barbed, was rusted wire, German defensive wire, still strung with frozen tension after 80 years. Alexei worked at it with growing frustration and disgust. This wasn't the clean recovery he'd imagined. This was a puzzle of death that fought his every attempt to separate its pieces. He pulled out wire cutters for the barbed wire, and when that didn't work, he used bolt cutters on the thicker sections. The MP-40 was the prize if he could separate it from the bones. It was worth at least 1,000 euros, possibly more if the mechanism was intact. He braced his foot against the ribcage for leverage and pulled. The weapon came free with a sound like breaking pottery, and the temperature dropped, not gradually, not like a cold wind blowing in. The change was instant and absolute, as if someone had opened a freezer door directly behind him. His breath, which had been visible in the October chill, now formed dense clouds that hung in the air. The frost on the grass around him spread visibly, creeping across the dead leaves like a living thing. Alexei's flashlight, which had been perfectly reliable LED technology, flickered once and died. Absolute darkness swallowed him. He fumbled for his backup light, a smaller pen light on his keychain. His fingers were already growing numb with cold. Before he could find it, he heard the sound. Click, clock. A mechanical sound, very close. Metal on metal, precise and deliberate. The sound of a rifle bolt being chambered. Alexei froze, his heart hammering. He wasn't alone. Someone else was here. Security police, another digger. He opened his mouth to call out, to explain, to negotiate. Then he heard the voices' whispers in German, sharp and urgent, words he couldn't understand, but whose tone was unmistakable, combat communication, warning signals, position reports, and answering them low and guttural and growing in volume. A Russian war cry from a dozen throats at once. Yura, Yura. The sound crashed over him like a physical wave. Alexei's penlight finally came free, and he thumbed it on with shaking hands. The beam illuminated nothing. No, that wasn't quite right. It illuminated the ravine, the trees, the disturbed earth around his excavation. But moving through that normal landscape were shapes that light passed through, but couldn't quite dispel. Figures made of ash and frost, translucent, but horribly detailed. German soldiers in greatcoats and helmets, crouched in firing positions that were no longer there, aiming rifles at enemies that existed 80 years ago. Soviet troops charging up an incline that had long since been smoothed over, their mouths open in silent screams, bayonets fixed on rifles held at waist level. They weren't looking at him. They weren't aware of him at all. They were locked in their own frozen moment, replaying the assault that had killed them over and over and over. As Alexei watched in paralyzed horror, a spectral German soldier turned and fired directly through the space where Alexei crouched. He felt nothing. The bullet was as immaterial as the soldier who fired it. But immediately, a Soviet soldier materialized in mid-run and collapsed, clutching his chest, falling through the earth as if the ground itself would swallow him. The phantoms were everywhere now, dozens of them, then hundreds. The ravine was packed with fighting men, their silent violence playing out in a tableau of eternal slaughter. They struggled hand to hand, stabbed with bayonets, swung entrenching tools at each other's heads. None of it made a sound except for those initial cries, the warning in German, the war cry in Russian, which repeated on a loop, echoing from somewhere that wasn't quite in sync with the visible world. Alexei tried to stand, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The cold was spreading through his body, making his muscles rigid. He looked down and saw his excavation had changed. The hole he dug was deeper now, much deeper, the sides collapsing inward to form a crater. And in that crater, hands were emerging from the earth. Skeletal hands, some still wrapped in rotted cloth, clawing their way up toward the surface toward him. He found his voice and screamed. The sound broke whatever paralysis held him. Alexei grabbed his backpack, his expensive equipment be damned, and ran. He ran through the phantom soldiers, and though they didn't see him, he felt them. Each time a spectral form overlapped with his living body, he experienced a flash of sensation, the bone-deep exhaustion of men who'd fought for weeks without sleep, the burning cold of frostbite, the sharp terror of incoming artillery fire, the crushing despair of knowing you were already dead. Behind him, the sounds changed. The whispers became shouts. The shouts became screams. And under it all, a new sound, the wet, heavy noise of digging. Not his digging. Something digging up, clawing toward the surface, trying to follow him. Alexei crashed through underbrush, slid down embankments, ignored the paths entirely in his panic to get away. His lungs burned. His legs threatened to give out. He didn't look back. He couldn't look back because some primal part of his brain knew that if he saw what was following him, his sanity would snap like ice under a boot heel. He burst out of the memorial complex grounds onto a street lit by sodium lights. The orange glow never looking so beautiful behind him, the darkness at the edge of the memorial seemed to pulse, as if debating whether to follow. Then it receded, flowing back like a living tide. Alexei collapsed against a parked car, gasping, his entire body shaking. He became aware of pain in his hands and looked down. His palms were shredded, cut by dozens of small sharp objects he'd apparently grabbed while running. Not rocks, not thorns, human teeth. His pockets, his backpack, the cuffs of his pants, all full of teeth, hundreds of them, yellow and brown with age, some still attached to fragments of jaw. He didn't remember picking them up. He didn't remember touching anything but the dirt and the weapon, but they were there, physical and real, a reminder that what he'd experienced wasn't hallucination or panic attack. The local police found him at dawn, still sitting against that car, unresponsive. His expensive equipment, thousands of euros worth of detectors and tools, was gone, abandoned in that ravine. When they asked him what happened, he couldn't answer. The words wouldn't form. His throat worked, but no sound emerged except a thin, wheezing whisper. The medical examination found him physically unharmed except for the lacerations on his hands and an unusual condition. His hair, which had been dark brown when he began his dig, had turned startlingly gray at the temples and crown. The doctor noted it in her report, but had no explanation. Stress could turn hair white over time, but not in a single night. Alexei never returned to black digging. He couldn't. The smell of disturbed earth made him nauseous. The sight of metal detectors in shop windows triggered panic attacks. He took a job in a warehouse, pushing paper, living a quiet life. But sometimes, late at night, he still heard them, the whispers in German, the war cries in Russian, and underneath it all, the patient, persistent sound of something digging its way toward the surface, looking for the man who disturbed its grave. He never told his daughter why he stopped providing for her the way he used to. How could he explain that some debts aren't worth the cost, that some treasures carry a price that compounds with interest into eternity? The teeth, sealed in a plastic bag by police as evidence, remained unclaimed in a storage locker. No one wanted to touch them, and on certain nights, when the temperature dropped and the wind blew in from the steppe, officers working late shifts swore they could hear sounds coming from that sealed bag, not rattling. Something worse, the sound of teeth chattering in fear. Greed is a powerful motivator. It drives men to risk their lives, their freedom, their souls for profit, but it is nothing compared to another instinct, one that is even more fundamental, the instinct to hold your ground. History tells us that Mamayev Kurgan changed hands 14 times during the Battle of Stalingrad. 14 times, men died by the thousands to take and retake the same piece of elevated earth. 14 times. Commanders looked at the casualty reports and decided the price was worth it, because without that hill, everything else was lost. But for those who walk the grounds alone at night, who work security shifts in the empty hours before dawn, the count is wrong. The hill is still being contested. The 15th assault is already underway, has been underway for 80 years, fought by soldiers who don't know they're dead and can't understand why the battle never ends. Our next story comes from a man who learned this truth the hard way. A skeptic who thought ghosts were superstition and history was safely in the past. Grigory Sokolov was wrong on both counts, and one winter night he found himself caught in a crossfire that defies every law of physics and common sense. The war on Mamayev Kurgan never ended. It just learned to wait for witnesses. Story 2. Shift 14, Grigory Sokolov was 53 years old, a former military policeman with the Soviet Army, and he had precisely zero patience for supernatural nonsense. He'd worked as night security for the Mamayev Kurgan Memorial Complex for 6 years, and in that time he'd dealt with drunks trying to climb the monuments, teenagers sneaking in to vandalize or make out, and the occasional black digger like Alexei, trying their luck on the grounds. He'd never seen a ghost, never heard mysterious sounds that couldn't be explained by wind or settling earth, never felt the supposedly oppressive presence that some of the younger guards whispered about. Superstitious idiots, he'd mutter, sipping his tea in the security booth while watching the CCTV monitors cycle through their cameras. The dead stay dead. That is the only thing you can count on in this world. It was mid-January, a week after Russian Orthodox Christmas, when Grigory drew the overnight shift on one of the coldest nights of the year. The temperature had dropped to -23 Celsius, And the wind coming off the Volga River was brutal, cutting through layers of clothing like a blade. The forecast called for the cold snap to continue through the weekend. The memorial complex had closed early, the last visitors ushered out by 4 in the afternoon before the worst of the weather hit. Grigory didn't mind. Cold meant fewer troublemakers. He'd have a quiet night, maybe finish the detective novel he'd been reading, drink his thermos of tea, do his required rounds at midnight and 4 a.m., and collect his paycheck. Simple. The security booth was a small heated structure near the base of the main memorial stairs. Equipped with a heater, a desk, a kettle, and a bank of monitors showing feeds from 12 security cameras positioned throughout the complex. Most showed empty pathways and monuments glazed with frost. The wind created strange visual effects on camera, swirls of snow that could almost look like movement if you stared too long. Grigory had learned to ignore such things. At 11:47 p.m., he was reading his book when something on the monitors caught his attention. Camera 4, positioned to cover the northwestern slope, the same general area where Alexei had been found weeks earlier, though Grigory didn't make the connection, showed the usual view of a snow-covered hillside dotted with memorial markers. But as Grigory watched, the snow seemed to darken, not a shadow passing over it, but the snow itself turning from white to gray to black, as if some invisible substance was seeping up from beneath. Grigory leaned forward, frowning. Could be a malfunction, pixels dying on an aging camera. The equipment was all at least 10 years old, maintained on a shoestring budget. He switched to camera 5, which covered the adjacent area, normal. Back to camera 4. The darkening had spread, now covering perhaps 10 square meters of hillside. He picked up the radio. "Control, this is booth 3. I am seeing what might be an oil or chemical leak on the northwest slope. Camera 4, requesting authorization to investigate." Static then, booth 3, control, probably just shadow from the clouds. "If it is still there in 15 minutes, go check it out. Don't want to send you out in this cold for a camera glitch." Understood. Grigory kept watching. The dark area didn't spread further, but it didn't fade either. It just sat there, an inky stain on virgin snow. At 5 past midnight, he suited up, heavy winter coat, fur hat with ear flaps, insulated gloves, wool scarf wrapped around his face. He clipped his radio to his belt, grabbed his heavy rubberized flashlight, and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind had intensified, howling across the exposed hilltop with nothing to slow it down. Grigory's eyes immediately began to water, tears freezing on his cheeks. He cursed under his breath and started up the main pathway, following the route he'd walked hundreds of times before. The memorial complex at night was always eerie. He could admit that much without feeding the ghost story nonsense. The massive statues and reliefs depicting Soviet soldiers in combat took on strange dimensions in darkness, their shadows long and distorted. The eternal flame at the base of the main monument flickered in its protected enclosure, the only warm light visible for hundreds of meters. Above it all loomed the Motherland Calls statue, her sword raised toward the winter stars, her concrete face frozen in that eternal scream of defiance. Grigory kept his head down against the wind and climbed. Camera 4 covered an area about 300 meters northwest of the main memorial, where a series of smaller monuments marked individual unit positions. The pathway there was less maintained, more prone to ice. He walked carefully, his flashlight beam bouncing ahead of him. He reached the area shown on the camera and stopped. The snow was indeed dark, not black, as it had appeared on the monitor, but stained a deep rusty brown, as if someone had spilled old oxidized blood across a 10-meter patch of ground. Grigory crouched down and pulled off one glove, touching the snow carefully. It was snow, cold, crystalline, normal snow, but it was definitely discolored. And when he brought his fingers close to his face, He caught a smell, copper and iron, and something organic and old. He stood up, wiping his hand on his coat, suddenly uneasy. This wasn't a chemical leak. This was something seeping up from the ground itself. He'd heard stories about bodies buried in shallow graves, sometimes contaminating groundwater, but those were bodies buried in soil. The official war graves here were properly maintained, sealed under memorial construction. This shouldn't be happening. He keyed his radio. Control, Booth 3. You need to get the memorial director out here. Something's wrong with the ground on the northwest slope. It is. Static exploded in his ear. So loud he ripped the earpiece out with a gasp. He looked at the radio. All the indicator lights were flashing randomly. The LCD screen scrambled into gibberish. Dead, completely dead, and not from cold. The batteries were fresh. The unit had been working perfectly minutes ago. Grigori looked around. The wind had stopped, completely instantly. The howling that had been constant since he'd stepped outside was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against his eardrums. The cold remained, intensified even, but the air was perfectly, impossibly still. He turned to head back to the booth and stopped. The pathway behind him was gone, not hidden by darkness or snow, gone. Where concrete steps should have descended toward the main memorial, there was only churned mud, frozen into vicious ruts and ridges. Where memorial walls and plaques should have stood, there was nothing but shattered tree stumps and the twisted remains of barbed wire. The city of Volgograd, whose lights should have been visible for kilometers in every direction, had vanished. In its place, a red glow pulsed on the horizon, the unmistakable signature of a city burning. Grigori stood paralyzed, his mind trying and failing to process what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. Cities didn't disappear. Modern construction didn't revert to mud and ruins. This was hallucination, hypothermia, maybe a stroke. The sound of boots crunching on frozen ground snapped his attention to the left. Men were coming up the hill, dozens of them, moving in a slow, steady advance. They wore field, gray greatcoats and coal, scuttle helmets, their breath steaming in the frozen air. German soldiers, World War II, German soldiers. They climbed in near silence, weapons at the ready, moving with the exhausted but practiced efficiency of troops who'd been fighting too long. One of them walked directly toward where Grigori stood. Grigori stumbled backward, tripped over something, a rock, a frozen corpse. He didn't look, and fell into a crater, a shell crater, perhaps 3 meters across and 2 deep, the walls slick with ice. He scrambled to the far side and pressed himself flat, his heart hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. The Germans crested the hill and stopped, taking up defensive positions. Grigori could see them clearly despite the darkness, too clearly as if they were lit by a light source he couldn't identify. Their faces were wrong, hollow, eyed, skin pulled tight over skulls, expressions of absolute despair. These weren't men. These were animated corpses, going through the motions of a battle they'd already lost, already died in. A flare burst in the air above the hill, bathing everything in stark magnesium white. And then the artillery came. The sound was indescribable. Grigori had done his military service, had heard artillery exercises. This was different. This was saturation bombardment. Dozens of shells arriving simultaneously, the explosions overlapping into a continuous world, ending roar that obliterated thought and replaced it with pure animal terror. The frozen earth heaved. Chunks of ice and dirt and things that might have been bone fragments rained down into the crater where Grigori huddled. He couldn't breathe. The concussive force of the explosions was sucking the air from his lungs, replacing it with dust and smoke and the chemical reek of high explosives. Through the chaos, he heard the war cry, "Yura, Yura, Yura." Soviet soldiers emerged from the smoke, hundreds of them bayonets fixed, charging up the hill in a human wave. They wore padded jackets and fur hats, their faces wrapped in scarves against the cold. Unlike the Germans, these men's faces weren't hollow. They were twisted with rage and terror and a kind of manic determination that transcended sanity. The Germans opened fire, machine guns, rifles, the sharper crack of pistols. The Soviet lines staggered, men falling, but the wave didn't break. It crashed into the German position like water against rocks. And then the fighting was hand to hand, close quarters butchery with bayonets and entrenching tools and bare hands. Grigory watched from the crater as the battle raged above him. He tried to close his eyes, to shut it out, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen, forced to witness as men killed and died in ways that would haunt him forever. A Soviet soldier bayoneted a German in the stomach, then took a bullet to the face and fell backward into the crater, landing less than a meter from where Grigory crouched. The body was real, solid. Grigory could see the individual threads in the uniform, could smell the copper tang of fresh blood, could see the exit wound where the bullet had blown out the back of the man's skull. Then the man sat up. His face was gone, replaced by a cratered mess of bone and tissue. But he sat up, turned his head as if looking for something, and then stood and climbed out of the crater to rejoin the fight. Grigory's sanity bent, but didn't quite break. He understood, with a clarity that bypassed rational thought, what was happening. This wasn't his time. He'd somehow slipped through into January 1943, into the actual battle, into the moment when this particular assault and counter-assault had taken place. The hill was replaying its history, and he was caught in the playback. A German soldier rolled into the crater. Clutching a wound in his side, he looked directly at Grigory with eyes that were simultaneously present and distant, seeing but not comprehending. His lips moved. He was speaking in German, the words coming out in bursts between pained gasps. Grigory didn't speak German, but somehow, impossibly, he understood. Won't end, can't end. We keep fighting. Why do we keep fighting? The German soldier's eyes closed. His breathing stopped, and he collapsed. But he didn't disappear. The body remained solid and present. Above the crater, the battle reached a crescendo. The Soviet war cry was everywhere now, drowning out the gunfire and the screams. Grigory risked looking over the edge of the crater and immediately wished he hadn't. The Soviet wave had broken through the German line. The Germans were falling back. No, not falling back, dying, being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and fury. Bodies were piling up in drifts like snow. The ground was slick with blood that steamed in the frozen air. And still they kept fighting. Men with mortal wounds fought on. Men with missing limbs fought on. Dead men stood up and fought on. Then the barrage came again, but this time from the other direction. German counter, battery fire targeting the Soviet troops now occupying the hilltop. Shells screamed in from the south, and Grigory ducked back into the crater as the world above him dissolved into fire and shrapnel. When the bombardment lifted, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. Grigory counted to 10, then 20, then 50, waiting for his ears to stop ringing. Slowly he raised his head above the crater's edge. The hill was covered in dead, hundreds of them, German and Soviet mixed together, frozen in their final moments. But as Grigory watched, some of them began to move, not all, just some. They stood up, collected their weapons, and began to advance. The Germans headed south, back down the hill. The Soviets headed north toward new positions. They were going to do it again. 14 assaults, 14 counter-assaults. And he was going to witness all of them, trapped in this frozen moment of hell, unable to leave, unable to die, unable to do anything but watch history repeat itself over and over. No, he whispered. No, no, no. He tried to climb out of the crater to run, but his body wouldn't respond. His legs were numb, unresponsive. He looked down and saw why. Spectral hands had emerged from the walls of the crater and were gripping his ankles, his calves, his knees. The frozen dead were holding him, keeping him in place, forcing him to witness. Above him, the flare burst again, and he heard the artillery beginning its deadly song once more. Grigori screamed. They found him at 6:15 a.m. when the day shift arrived. He was lying in the snow on the northwest slope, roughly where camera 4 had shown the dark stain. Thou that stain was gone now, the snow pristine and white. Grigori wasn't moving. For a terrible moment, the day supervisor thought he'd died of exposure. But when they reached him, they saw his eyes were open, staring at the lightening sky, tears frozen on his cheeks. They got him inside, called an ambulance. The paramedics found his vitals stable, but his psychological state worrying. He didn't respond to questions, didn't react to light or sound. They transported him to the hospital as a potential stroke victim. But Grigori wasn't catatonic. He was listening, because even though he was in the ambulance, even though he could hear the paramedics talking and feel the warmth of the heated interior, he could still hear it underneath everything else, the artillery, the war cries, the screams. The hospital kept him for 3 days. Brain scans showed nothing abnormal. Blood work was clean. His vitals normalized within hours. But Grigori refused to speak. On the 4th day, a nurse making rounds found him sitting up in bed, staring at nothing, his lips moving in a silent count. 11, 12, 13, Mr. Sokolov. The nurse asked gently. Are you counting something? Grigori's eyes focused on her, and for the first time since being found, he truly saw another person. 14, he said, his voice like rust. It changed hands 14 times. The hill. Yes, we know. That is the history. Number Grigori shook his head. You don't understand. I was there. I watched all 14. Every assault, every counter-assault. They made me watch. The nurse noted the statement in his chart and increased his anti-anxiety medication. When Grigori was finally released a week later, he was given a clean bill of health with a recommendation for therapy to address what the doctors called acute stress reaction, possibly triggered by extended cold exposure. He never went back to his job. He couldn't. When they brought him his belongings from the security booth, he refused to touch his winter coat. When his supervisor called to check on him, Grigori asked one question, that stain on camera 4. Did it come back? No, the supervisor said. Must have been a glitch like we thought. But 3 weeks later, on the anniversary of one of the major assaults on Mamayev Kurgan, camera 4 did show something. A brief flicker like interference, and in that flicker, shapes moving across the hillside, dozens of them. Hundreds. The new night guard watched it happen and immediately requested a transfer. They approved it without question. Word had gotten around. Working night security at Mamayev Kurgan wasn't worth the pay, wasn't worth the pension, wasn't worth anything you could quantify in normal terms. Because the price of witnessing what happened there wasn't measured in rubles or psychological damage. It was measured in something much older and more fundamental. The piece of your soul that believes the world makes sense, that the past stays past. That death is an ending rather than a transition into eternal repeated suffering. Grigori kept counting. Even in his sleep, his wife would hear him mumbling numbers, 1 through 14 over and over, like a mantra or a prayer. But sometimes, late at night when the wind blew cold from the river, he would stop mid-count. And in the silence that followed, his wife swore she could hear it too. Distant voices raised in war cries, the rumble of artillery, and underneath it all, the wet sound of men dying in mud and snow. The 15th assault continues. It always has. It always will. Grigori survived the surface of Mamayev Kurgan, survived witnessing the psychic echo of the worst battle in human history. But the true horror of this battlefield isn't just what happened on top of the soil. It is what the soil itself has become. For our next story, We go beneath the earth, into the literal flesh of the hill. Because Mamayev Kurgan isn't just sitting on top of the dead, it is made of them. And sometimes, in the wet dark below the memorial, the dead remember they were buried alive. Story 3. The Flesh of the Hill. Mark Delaney was an American geotechnical engineer, 38 years old, a specialist in soil stabilization and erosion control. He'd worked on projects across 4 continents, reinforcing hillsides in California, preventing mudslides in Colombia, stabilizing ancient ruins in Greece. When the Mamayev Kurgan Memorial Foundation contracted his firm to assess and address soil erosion issues around the massive monuments, he saw it as just another job, historically significant, sure, but from an engineering perspective, just soil and stone and concrete. He was wrong. Mark arrived in Volgograd in late March, when the winter snow was melting, but spring rain hadn't yet begun. Perfect conditions for surveying. The Memorial Foundation was concerned about several areas where drainage seemed inadequate, where the constant flow of visitors was causing pathway degradation, and most urgently, where recent heavy rains had opened small fissures in the hillside that could, if left untreated, compromise the stability of the monuments themselves. Our primary concern, the foundation director explained in heavily accented English, is this area here. He pointed to a location on a topographical map about 50 meters southwest of the Motherland Calls statue. After last week's storms, a sinkhole appeared, small now but growing. We need to understand what is happening beneath the surface before we can fix it. Mark nodded, making notes on his tablet. Standard procedure. We'll do ground-penetrating radar first to map the subsurface structure, then core samples to understand soil composition. If there is a void developing, we can inject stabilizing foam or you'll want protective equipment, the director interrupted. Not just safety gear. Gloves, mask, full coverage. Mark glanced up, puzzled. Is there contamination, chemical weapons, unexploded ordnance? Number not that kind of danger, the director paused, choosing his words carefully. The ground here, after heavy rain, things surface remains. The hill is not entirely cleared. Human remains, yes, and other things. Metal, glass, bone. All mixed together. Be prepared for that. Mark had worked on historical sites before, had accidentally uncovered forgotten graves and old dump sites. He understood the sensitivity required. I'll be respectful, and will report any remains to your cultural authority for proper handling. Good, but the director's expression suggested this wouldn't be as straightforward as Mark imagined. The sinkhole was indeed growing. What the foundation had described as small was now a depression about 2 meters across and easily 1.5 meters deep, with cracks radiating outward. Mark set up his equipment ground-penetrating radar first, as planned, and began his survey. The radar readings were strange. Modern GPR can identify soil layers, rock formations, voids, and even buried objects with reasonable clarity. But Mark's screen kept showing scatter patterns that didn't make sense. The subsurface wasn't stratified like normal Earth. Instead, it looked almost fibrous, interwoven, as if the ground itself had structure beyond simple geological layering. He switched to core sampling. His drill rig was a portable unit, capable of extracting cylindrical samples up to 5 meters deep. He positioned it at the edge of the sinkhole and started the first core. The drill chewed through the first meter easily, topsoil and clay, normal post-glacial composition. But at 1.2 meters, the bit slowed dramatically, encountering something that was simultaneously brittle and tough. The motor groaned, struggling, before finally breaking through. When Mark raised the core sample, he understood the director's warning. The cylinder contained dirt, yes, but threaded through it like veins through tissue were fragments of everything, rusted metal shards. splinters of wood, glass beads that might have been bottle fragments or optical equipment, corroded brass that could have been shell casings, and bone. Lots of bone, small fragments crushed and compacted, some burned black, some bleached white, all jumbled together in a matrix that looked less like soil and more like some kind of industrial slag. Mark had seen photographs of the battlefield. He knew the casualty figures, but knowing intellectually that tens of thousands died here was different from holding physical proof in his hands, proof that they hadn't just died here. They'd been processed by the battle itself into a kind of geological layer. He took photographs, labeled the sample, and moved the drill to extract a deeper core. That night, the rain began. Not the gentle spring showers Mark had been hoping would hold off until his survey was complete, but a torrential downpour that turned the memorial complex into a mud pit within hours. He stayed in his hotel, monitoring weather reports, watching the forecast push his timeline back by days. On the third day of constant rain, he got an urgent call from the foundation director. "The sinkhole, it is collapsed. You need to see this." Mark drove through the rain, his rental car's wipers barely keeping up with the deluge. He reached the memorial complex to find emergency vehicles, portable lights, and workers with shovels trying to redirect water away from what was no longer a sinkhole, but a full-scale fissure, a crack in the earth at least 4 meters across and dropping into darkness. "How deep?" Mark asked. Staring into the void. "We don't know. We dropped a weighted line 15 meters and didn't hit bottom." Mark felt excitement despite the weather. This was significant. A cavity this large could indicate a much larger erosion problem, possibly destabilizing the entire hillside. "I need to go down." "Absolutely not," the director said. "It is not safe. The walls could collapse further, which is exactly why I need to assess it now before more damage occurs." Mark was already mentally cataloging the equipment he'd need. "I've done cavity surveys before. I'll take all necessary precautions." 2 hours later, Mark was harnessed and clipped into a rappelling system, with portable floodlights being lowered ahead of him. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, but water was still running into the fissure, creating a small waterfall that splashed into the darkness below. He descended slowly, carefully, his feet finding purchase on the uneven walls. The floodlights illuminated a cavern that seemed to have opened naturally along existing weaknesses in the substrate. The walls glistened with moisture, and the air smelled wrong. Not the clean mineral scent of natural caves, but something organic, almost sweet, with an undertone of copper. At 10 meters down, the walls changed. Mark's headlamp illuminated the surface, and he stopped, momentarily confused by what he was seeing. The walls were pale, almost white in the LED light, with a texture that looked almost porous, like bone, old bone, compacted and calcified, but not scattered fragments like in his core samples. This was structural, continuous, as if someone had built the walls from... Oh God! Mark's hand, steadying him against the wall, was touching a femur, an entire femur still articulated with part of a pelvis, embedded horizontally in what he'd thought was rock. He pulled his hand back and looked closer. The entire wall was bones, human bones compressed together, mixed with clay and rust, but recognizable if you knew what you were looking for. Skulls, ribs, vertebrae, arm bones and leg bones, and the smaller bones of hands and feet. Thousands of them, crushed together into a kind of ossuary matrix that the hill itself had formed. Mark's professional detachment cracked. He'd known intellectually that the bodies were here, buried by time and earth. But seeing the sheer density, understanding that he was surrounded by what amounted to compressed human remains, Mark. The radio on his belt crackled. Status. He keyed the mic with a shaking hand. "I am okay. But you need to see this. The substrate isn't Earth. It is. It is the bodies. The hill is made of them. Static then, copy that. How much further down are you going? Mark looked below. The floodlights were still descending, their illumination showing that the cavity opened up further down into a larger chamber. He needed to reach the bottom to fully assess the structural risk. Going to the bottom, stand by. He continued his descent, trying not to look at the walls, trying not to think about what he was touching every time he braced himself. The temperature was dropping as he went deeper, the air becoming more still, more heavy. At 15 meters, his feet touched something solid but yielding, like packed earth mixed with clay. He unclipped his safety line from the rappelling rope to give himself mobility and adjusted the floodlights to illuminate the space. It was a cavern roughly 8 meters across and perhaps 4 meters high. The ceiling was the same bone, composite as the walls, but here at the bottom, the floor was different. It was mostly mud, dark and wet, but protruding from it were shapes, the remains of larger metal objects, a tank tread, partially exposed, what looked like a steel beam from some defensive structure, the shattered remnants of weapons. Mark set up his equipment to take readings, documenting the cavity's dimensions and composition. This was going to require a major stabilization effort. The cavity had clearly formed when decades of gradual erosion finally undermined the compacted layers above, creating a void. The recent rain had accelerated the collapse. If left untreated, the entire section could give way, potentially undermining the monuments above. He was taking photographs when he heard the sound. Drip, drip, water from above, seeping through the compressed layers, collecting and dripping from the ceiling. Normal in a cavity like this, but as Mark's light swept across the ceiling, he noticed the water wasn't clear. It was dark, almost rust, colored, leaving stains where it fell. He moved the light back to the wall where his core sample drill had penetrated from above. The drill hole was visible, water running from it steadily. As he watched, something small fell from the hole and landed in the mud near his feet. Another tooth, and another small fragments of bone were beginning to wash out of the disturbed earth above, freed by the water penetrating the hill. Mark backed away from the falling debris, and as he did, his boots sank deeper into the mud than he'd expected. He tried to pull free and couldn't. His foot was stuck, not just in mud, but in something that had caught it, something with structure. He pulled harder and his boot came free, but with it came the thing that had trapped him, a skull, a human skull, still partially fleshed, still bearing fragments of skin and hair preserved by the wet, cold earth. Not ancient, not a skeleton, something in between, a corpse in suspended decay, caught in the moment between death and dissolution. Mark staggered backward, his heart hammering. That wasn't possible. The battle had been 80 years ago. Bodies didn't preserve that long, not without deliberate mummification. But as he looked at the mud around him, really looked, he saw them everywhere, shapes beneath the surface, lumps and contours that were too regular to be just mud and stones, bodies, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, buried in the cavity floor, preserved by the unique chemistry of the earth, saturated with iron and human remains, never fully decaying, never fully fossilizing, just waiting. The dripping intensified. Not just water now, the sound was thicker, more viscous. Mark looked up. The ceiling was weeping. That was the only word for it. Dark liquid was seeping through the bone, composite, running down the walls in dozens of small streams. The smell intensified, copper and rot and something else. Something that triggered the most primal parts of his brain, the parts that recognized death and screamed at him to flee. Then the walls began to shift, not dramatically, not a collapse, just a subtle movement, a settling accompanied by a sound like breaking pottery. Except it wasn't pottery, it was bones. Compressed bones shifting under pressure, finding new positions, and then they started to emerge, arms first. Skeletal arms punching through the wall matrix, fingers splayed, reaching. Then faces, or what remained of faces, skulls with leathery skin still attached, eye sockets empty but somehow looking, jawbones working as if trying to speak. Mark's professional paralysis broke. He lunged for the rappelling line, grabbed it, and started climbing hand over hand, abandoning his equipment. The emergency ascender clips bit into the rope, taking his weight, and he pulled himself up with strength born of pure terror. Below him, the sound intensified. The crack of breaking bones became a continuous percussion, like some hellish rhythm section. The smell followed him up, growing stronger, and underneath it all, a new sound: breathing, wet, labored breathing, multiplied by dozens of throats. They'd been buried alive. Some of them had been buried alive by cave-ins, by artillery collapse, by the sheer weight of subsequent bombardments crushing them down. And their panic, their desperate final moments, had never ended, had crystallized into the earth itself, waiting for someone to disturb them, to crack open their prison. Mark climbed faster. 15 meters, 12, 10. The sounds below were pursuing him, the walls of the fissure shuddering. He didn't look down, couldn't look down. At 5 meters, hands grabbed his harness from above. The workers, pulling him up the final distance, hauling him over the edge of the fissure and away from the opening. He collapsed on wet grass, gasping, his hands torn and bleeding from the rope burns. Behind him, the sounds from the fissure peaked and then suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, they heard a new sound, the groan of earth settling. The fissure was collapsing, the cavity ceiling giving way, filling the void with tons of earth and whatever had been trying to escape. The director ran up, breathless. "Are you hurt? What happened down there?" Mark couldn't answer. He just stared at the settling earth, at the fissure that was rapidly disappearing as the hillside collapsed in on itself, sealing whatever he'd disturbed back in its grave. Mark Delaney completed his report from his hotel room, recommending extensive stabilization work and multiple areas of concern. The Foundation accepted his recommendations and hired a different firm to do the actual work. Mark declined to stay on as a consultant, cited personal reasons, and flew back to California 3 days later. He never told anyone the full truth of what he'd seen in that cavity. Who would believe it? He barely believed it himself in the bright Los Angeles sunshine, surrounded by the normal world of traffic and beaches and people who'd never seen war. But the damage was done. Something fundamental had broken in Mark's understanding of the world. He couldn't go underground anymore, couldn't enter basements, couldn't park in underground garages. The first time he tried, 6 weeks after returning home. He'd made it 3 steps into the parking structure before the panic attack hit him. The walls closing in, the smell of wet concrete triggering memories of that other smell, the darkness pressing down. His career adapted. He specialized in above-ground structures, invisible, open-air projects. His colleagues joked that he'd developed late, onset claustrophobia. Mark let them think that. It was easier than the truth. But sometimes, late at night, in the space between waking and sleep, he was back in that cavity, and the walls were moving, and the faces were pushing through, and he understood with the clarity of nightmares that what he'd witnessed wasn't the dead trying to escape. It was the dead trying to pull him in, to make him part of the hill, to add his bones to the matrix. Because Mamayev Kurgan was hungry. It had been built on sacrifice, had grown from sacrifice. And sacrifice was the only language it understood. Mark never returned to Russia, never even flew over it if he could avoid it. Some places, some pieces of earth, weren't meant to be disturbed. And some graves weren't just warnings. They were traps, waiting patiently for the next victim to wander too close, to dig too deep, to disturb the sleeping dead who weren't sleeping at all. Just waiting, forever waiting, in the wet dark beneath the blood. Soaked earth. The earth is saturated with the dead, layer upon layer of them, compressed into a matrix of bone and steel and frozen panic. They're held in a prison of mud and iron, unable to rest, unable to escape, caught forever in the moment of their death. But towering over it all, watching it all, is a sentinel, a monument meant to honor the fallen, to commemorate their sacrifice with the largest freestanding statue in Europe. The motherland calls, 85 meters of steel, reinforced concrete, a woman with a sword raised to the sky, her mouth open in an eternal scream that could be interpreted as victory or rage or grief. The official story is that she calls her children to battle, to defend their homeland. But some who've stood at her feet in the dark hours, some who felt the weight of her concrete gaze, believe something different. They believe she is not calling them to battle. She is commanding them to continue it. Forever, Story 4, The Motherland Commands. Elena Rostova was 46 years old, a historian and archivist for the Volgograd Regional Museum. She'd spent 20 years studying the Battle of Stalingrad, cataloging survivors' testimonies, preserving documents, giving lectures to school groups and tourists. The battle was her life's work, not out of morbid fascination, but out of a deep conviction that such suffering must never be forgotten, never reduced to mere numbers in a textbook. Every year on the 2nd of February, the anniversary of the German surrender, Elena made a pilgrimage to Mamayev Kurgan to lay flowers at the eternal flame and spend a quiet hour in contemplation among the monuments. She did this alone, preferring the solemnity of private reflection to the official ceremonies with their speeches and military pageantry. This year, she arrived at dusk, just as the last tour groups were leaving, and the memorial complex was transitioning to its nighttime state. The guards knew her, waved her through with respectful nods. She carried a simple bouquet of carnations, red, the traditional color, and walked the familiar path toward the Hall of Military Glory and the eternal flame beyond. The weather forecast had called for clear skies, but as Elena climbed the memorial steps, she noticed clouds building on the eastern horizon, rolling in off the step with unnatural speed. The temperature, which had been a mild -5 degrees, began to drop rapidly. By the time she reached the eternal flame, her breath was visible in thick clouds, and the wind was picking up. She laid her flowers, said a quiet prayer for the dead. Elena wasn't religious, but this felt right, felt necessary, and was turning to leave when the first snowflakes began to fall. Within minutes, it was a blizzard, not the gradual buildup of a normal snowstorm, but an instantaneous whiteout, as if someone had flipped a switch. The wind howled across the exposed hilltop, driving snow horizontally with enough force to sting exposed skin. Visibility dropped to meters, then to nothing. Elena couldn't see the path she'd just walked up, couldn't see the monuments she knew were only meters away. She pulled out her phone, dead. The battery had been at 70% when she'd entered the memorial grounds. Now the screen was black, unresponsive. She pressed the power button repeatedly. Nothing. Elena wasn't panicked, not yet. She knew the layout of the memorial complex intimately. If she could find a wall or monument to use as a reference point, she could navigate by touch to one of the small maintenance buildings where she could wait out the storm. She turned slowly, trying to orient herself, and that is when she saw the statue. The Motherland Calls loomed out of the swirling snow like a ship emerging from fog. But Elena had laid her flowers at the eternal flame, which was 100 meters away from the statue's base. She shouldn't be able to see it from here, not in this visibility, not at this angle. Yet there it was, impossibly close, impossibly clear despite the blizzard. The massive concrete figure, sword raised, face frozen in that eternal scream, and in the scream, in the wind howling across the giant concrete sword held aloft, Elena heard something, a voice, not words, not exactly, but a sound that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her teeth, in her bones. In the hollow spaces of her skull, a booming, commanding tone that communicated meaning without language. Rise. Elena shook her head, trying to clear the auditory hallucination. The wind was creating acoustic effects. That was all. Wind across concrete could produce all sorts of strange sounds. She turned away from the statue, searching for landmarks in the white chaos. That is when she saw the shapes. At first, she thought they were other visitors caught in the storm, figures moving through the snow, indistinct but definitely human-shaped, walking with purpose toward the statue. Elena called out to them, but the wind tore her words away. More figures appeared, dozens of them. Then hundreds. They emerged from the snow itself, materializing like ink spreading through water. As they drew closer, Elena's relief at not being alone transformed into horror. These weren't people seeking shelter. These weren't people at all. They wore Soviet uniforms from the Great Patriotic War, long coats, fur hats, the distinctive silhouette of Red Army infantry. But their uniforms were torn, burned, frozen into rigid shapes. Their faces, those that still had faces, were pale as the snow around them, lips blue-black, with cold, eyes empty sockets, or frozen open in expressions of shock and pain. And they were marching, not shambling like the zombies of fiction. Marching with military precision, boots crunching on snow that should be too soft to crunch, moving in formation up the memorial steps toward the base of the massive statue. They flowed past Elena without acknowledging her presence, an army of the frozen dead answering some silent call. Elena backed away, her rational mind trying to assert that this wasn't happening, couldn't be happening, hallucination, hypothermia, some kind of mass hysteria or atmospheric phenomenon. But the cold was so real. The sound of their boots was so real. And when one of the spectral soldiers passed close enough to brush against her, she felt it, the absolute bone, deep cold of frozen flesh, a cold that no living thing could produce. She looked up at the statue, and her blood turned to ice. The concrete face had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would show up in photographs or that could be measured. But Elena knew this statue, had looked at it thousands of times from every angle, and now in the swirling snow, with the army of the dead marching toward its base, the face was different. The eyes were looking down, the mouth was moving, and the voice was speaking with a force that shook the ground. Defend. The spectral soldiers were gathering at the statue's base, forming ranks, assembling by unit with a discipline that transcended death. And as Elena watched in frozen horror, they began to march outward, deploying across the hilltop as if responding to an attack that only they could see. She understood then, with the clarity of absolute terror, what she was witnessing. The statue wasn't just a memorial, it was a beacon, a rallying point, and these soldiers trapped in the earth for 80 years were still responding to it, still answering the call to defend the motherland, still following orders given by a concrete monument that had become something more than stone and steel. The voice boomed again, each syllable resonating in Elena's chest like a physical blow. Hold. The spectral army stopped their deployment and turned as one toward the southern slope. Elena followed their gaze and saw what they saw, another army, emerging from the snow, German soldiers, field gray uniforms, coal, scuttle helmets, weapons at the ready. They climbed the hill in eerie silence, and as they reached the crest, the two phantom armies clashed. But this wasn't the chaotic, brutal combat that had actually occurred here in 1943. This was different, ritualized. The soldiers met in the same formations, struck the same blows, fell in the same patterns as they had 80 years ago. It was a reenactment, but one performed by the actual participants, forced to repeat their deaths over and over in an eternal loop, and conducting it all, the voice of the statue advance. The Soviet soldiers pushed forward, the Germans fell back, and the pattern repeated. 14 times the hill had changed hands. 14 times these men had died, and they were going to do it again forever because the monument demanded it. Because the statue had become the physical embodiment of the order that had sent them to their deaths, hold this position. Take that hill. Sacrifice everything. Elena tried to run. Her legs moved, but slowly, as if she was wading through deep water. The storm had intensified, the snow now so thick she couldn't see more than a meter in any direction, and everywhere she turned, the battle was happening. Spectral soldiers fighting, dying, vanishing into the snow only to reform and fight again. She stumbled, fell, crawled forward on hands and knees. The snow was deep here, deeper than it should be after only minutes of snowfall. Her hands touched something hard beneath the snow, metal. She brushed the snow away and saw a helmet. Then another. The ground was littered with them, spectral equipment from spectral soldiers, somehow solid enough to touch. The voice called out again, and this time Elena felt it not just in her bones, but in her mind, a compulsion, a command that bypassed consciousness and spoke directly to something deeper, something primal. Join Elena's body began to stand without her conscious control. Her legs straightened, her back stiffened. Her arms fell to her sides in a position of attention. She was marching, walking toward the statue's base, drawn by an irresistible command that turned her own body into a puppet. Around her, other figures appeared, not the uniformed soldiers of the battle, but civilians. Modern civilians, their clothing contemporary, their faces showing the same terror Elena felt. They walked in formation toward the statue, and Elena understood with growing horror what they were. These were the missing, the people who'd vanished from Mamayev Kurgan over the years, the cases that had been written off as runaways or accidents or drunken falls into the Volga. They weren't missing. They were here trapped in the statue's command, adding their life force to the eternal battle, becoming fuel for the memorial's dark purpose. Elena wanted to scream, but her throat wouldn't obey. She wanted to resist, but her body marched forward with mechanical precision. She was going to join them, going to become another missing person, another unsolved disappearance, another sacrifice to the hill's insatiable hunger. The statue loomed before her, impossibly tall, the sword raised against the churning sky. The concrete face looked down at Elena, directly now, the eyes tracking her approach. The mouth opened wider, and from that concrete throat came the command that would seal her fate: serve. Elena's hand reached out toward the statue's base, ready to touch it, to complete whatever ritual would bind her to this place forever. Her fingers were centimeters from the cold concrete when something inside her rebelled. Number, it was a tiny word, a whisper against the roar of the command, but it was hers, her will, her choice. Number, she wrenched her hand back, and the motion broke whatever spell had controlled her body. Elena fell to the ground, scrambling backward, and her hand closed around something solid, a lamppost, one of the modern aluminum poles that lit the memorial paths at night. It was contemporary, real, a piece of the present in this nightmare vision of the past. She wrapped both arms around it and held on. The command came again, stronger, more insistent. Serve, defend, join. The words battered at her mind like physical blows, her muscles strained, trying to obey, trying to pull her toward the statue. The other figures, the missing, reached the statue's base and vanished into it, absorbed by the concrete as if it were liquid, their screams cut off instantly. Elena held on to the lamppost. Her arms ached. Her hands were going numb from the cold. The spectral battle raged around her, soldiers fighting and dying in their eternal pattern. And the statue watched, commanded, demanded more sacrifice to fuel its purpose. Time became meaningless. Elena existed in a single endless moment of resistance, holding the lamppost as if it were the only real thing left in the world. Maybe it was. Then, gradually, the darkness began to lighten. Not the darkness of night. It was the darkness of the storm, the supernatural blizzard that had brought the spectral army. The snow began to thin. the wind died down. And with the first rays of dawn piercing through the breaking clouds, the voice stopped. Elena looked up. The statue was just a statue again. Concrete and steel, magnificent and imposing but inanimate. The face screamed at the sky but saw nothing. The sword pointed toward the east but commanded no one. The bodies were gone. The spectral soldiers had vanished with the darkness, drawn back into the earth to wait for the next time. The modern figures, the missing, were gone too, though whether they'd been freed or were still trapped somewhere, Elena didn't know. She was alone on the hill, clinging to a lamppost, her clothes soaked with snow, her body shaking with cold and shock. The day shift guards found her an hour later when they arrived to open the memorial complex. They wrapped her in blankets, gave her hot tea from a thermos, called an ambulance. Elena didn't speak, couldn't speak. Her hands were locked around the lamppost, and it took 2 guards working together to pry her fingers loose. The hospital kept her for observation. Severe hypothermia, they said, though they couldn't explain how she'd gotten so cold when the night had been relatively mild. When she could finally speak, 2 days later, she told them she'd gotten lost in a sudden storm. They didn't believe her. There had been no storm that night. The weather records showed clear skies, but Elena's clothing told a different story, soaked through, covered in snow that had somehow stayed frozen despite the hospital's heat, and her hands bore strange marks, deep impressions, as if she'd been gripping something for hours with all her strength. Elena never went back to Mamayev Kurgan. She submitted her resignation to the museum by email, citing health reasons. Her 20 years of research, all her archived materials, her life's work. She donated it all to the museum library and asked them to never contact her about it again. She moved to Moscow, as far from Volgograd as she could get while staying in Russia. She took a job teaching high school history, focusing on periods far removed from World War II. When students asked about her expertise in the Battle of Stalingrad, she changed the subject. But every year on the 2nd of February, Elena stays inside, locks the doors, closes the curtains. She unplugs every electronic device. She learned that phones die in the presence of whatever commands the hill, and she waits for the day to pass, terrified that somehow, across the 1,000 kilometers between Moscow and Volgograd, she'll hear it again, that booming, inexorable voice, commanding her to return, to serve, to join the eternal battle that rages on the bloodiest hill in Europe, where the dead don't rest, and the monument meant to honor them has become their prison, and their tormentor, demanding sacrifice forever and ever, world without end. The motherland calls, and some nights, in the space between sleep and waking, Elena fears she is still listening. Mamayev Kurgan, Hill 102, the bloodiest hill on earth. I've shared 4 stories with you today. 4 encounters with the paranormal residue of the Battle of Stalingrad. Alexei and his greed leading him into a trap of the spectral dead. Grigory witnessing the hill change hands for the 15th, 16th, 100th time in an endless loop of violence. Mark descending into the literal flesh of the hill, into the compressed remains of thousands who died here. And Elena standing at the feet of a monument that has become something far more terrible than simple concrete and steel. These aren't legends. These aren't stories told around campfires, growing in the telling until truth becomes myth. These are documented experiences from the last few years, corroborated by medical reports, police records, psychological evaluations. People who went to Mamayev Kurgan for normal reasons, profit, duty, professional obligation, historical commemoration, and encountered something that defied their understanding of reality. Because Mamayev Kurgan is a place where history isn't just remembered, it is relived every single night. The battle never ended for the men who died there. They're still fighting, still following orders, still locked in the frozen moment of their deaths. The violence was so concentrated, so absolute, that it burned itself into the earth like a scar that won't heal. The compasses still don't work on the hill. The density of metal in the soil remains high enough to disrupt magnetic fields. Workers still find remains regularly: bones, equipment, unexploded ordnance. The official count of cleared items is staggering: over 1 million explosives diffused, hundreds of thousands of individual items recovered, and yet they keep finding more, as if the earth itself is rejecting them, pushing them up toward the surface. And the reports continue: night guards requesting transfers, maintenance workers refusing assignments, locals avoiding the memorial after dark, stories of lights where no lights should be, sounds of artillery fire on clear, calm nights, figures moving through the snow when no snow is falling. The official position is that these are all explicable: hallucinations caused by isolation, acoustic tricks of wind over concrete, the power of suggestion in a place so historically charged. But the reports keep coming, and the patterns are too consistent, too specific, to dismiss entirely. Something remains on Mamayev Kurgan, something that transcends our comfortable understanding of life and death, of past and present. The hill demanded such sacrifice, consumed so many lives in such a brief period, that it became more than just a battlefield. It became a thin place, a wound in reality where the normal rules don't quite apply, and towering over it all, watching over the memorial complex with her raised sword and eternal scream, the motherland calls, a testament to sacrifice, yes, a monument to honor the fallen, absolutely, but perhaps also something more, a beacon that won't let the dead rest, a commander who still gives orders, a reminder that some battles are never truly over. The earth on Mamayev Kurgan will never truly wash clean. Too much blood has soaked into it. Too many bodies are compressed into its layers. Too much violence has marked it. And those who died there, who gave everything in the belief that they were defending something worth dying for, remain waiting, fighting, trapped in eternal service to a cause that ended 80 years ago, but continues in the shadows and the silence. That is the true horror of Mamayev Kurgan. Not that it is haunted, that almost seems too simple. It is that it remains a battlefield, with the same stakes, the same desperation, the same absolute conviction that this piece of ground matters more than life itself, and it is waiting for the next person to walk its paths after dark. The next investigator who gets too curious, the next digger who gets too greedy, the next historian who wants to get too close to history. It is waiting to add them to its count, to press them into its layers, to make them part of the flesh of the hill forever. Have you ever visited a battlefield and felt that heavy, chilling presence of those who never left? That sense that you are being watched, not by the living, but by something else. That feeling that the ground beneath your feet holds secrets that aren't quite ready to rest. Let me know your experiences in the comments below. I read every one, and I am always looking for new stories, new encounters, new evidence that history leaves marks deeper than we understand. If these stories chilled you to the bone, if you felt that creeping sense of dread as we descended into the horrors of Mamayev Kurgan, do your part for the channel. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this content matters, that these stories need to be heard. Share this video with a fellow history lover or horror enthusiast. Post it on your social media. Send it to that friend who is always looking for something genuinely unsettling. And subscribe to Ghost Stories of the Battles. We're not done with the dark places of history. Every conflict leaves scars, and some of those scars are deeper than others. Next time, we're heading to the Pacific, to islands where the jungle has reclaimed the trenches but hasn't silenced the screams. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss a deployment into the dark. Until next time, respect the fallen, remember their sacrifice, honor their memory, but be careful where you tread. Some places don't want to be remembered, they want to be left alone. And Mamayev Kurgan, it doesn't want either. It wants company, See you in the next one. Stay safe out there. And if you ever find yourself in Volgograd, if you visit the memorial, if you climb the steps and stand before that massive statue with her raised sword, visit during the day and leave before dark. Trust me on this one.